Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Did I miss any? Late morning? I don't know. Hi. Welcome to the GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast. Brought to you by the GSMC GSMC Podcast Network. It's not just the science fiction podcast network. We have a ton of different podcasts. We've got movies, music, entertainment, etc. You'll hear advertisements for them throughout the show. So, yeah, check some of those other ones out. So this week, or this Sunday rather, we are getting back to our discussion on the book Hyperion. As anybody who's been following the podcast knows, every Sunday I put out an episode for a chapter of Hyperion. So this week is no different than that. We've got our third chapter and our third tale today. Last week I had thought that there was a whole chapter without a tale, but there was not. So it was definitely chapter 1 that had Father Hoyt and Father Duran. I think, yeah, what are their names? So that was interesting. Actually, that's been the best one so far, in my opinion. I don't know how many chapters there are in this book. I should probably look so that I can kind of get a gauge of where I'm at. But it's been really interesting. I liked General Kassad's story, and I didn't really think that I was going to have enough material to have a discussion on it for an hour. What's funny is I didn't end up even talking about everything that I wanted to. I'd have to go back and re-listen to the episode to figure out what it was that I missed exactly. But we got pretty close to covering most of it. This next story, the third chapter, we get the tale of Martin Silenas, which I found to be pretty cool. He does this thing. It's pretty common in science fiction novels and things like that. Dan Simmons does, where he kind of, these tropes that we're all familiar with from regular storytelling as well as other science fiction books, and kind of manipulates them in a way that provides us some commentary, some really interesting commentary on the nature of, I guess, creation in a way. Martin Silenas is the poet, and he titles his story as the Hyperion Chronicles, and he kind of tells it as if he were writing it, which I found to be pretty interesting. I had to guess, I would guess that Simmons sees the most of himself in Silenas as far as his viewpoint of the world is concerned. It also seems like Silenas is kind of, maybe not like a foil for Simmons, but just a way for Simmons to kind of represent certain things in the space of writing. And so it's kind of his way to get a little bit of his angst out about writing. And I think also what's interesting is this chapter is kind of the first time we get that predictive aspect of science fiction that a lot of not necessarily post-apocalyptic but dystopian novels use. We get Dan Simmons talking a lot about different predictions that he has based on the way in which civilization is trending currently and the propensities that he believes humans to have as individuals, all of which I found to be pretty interesting. So we're going to be diving, I want to say delving, diving, jumping, whatever you want to say. We're going to be looking at that pretty thoroughly today because there's a lot of meat on this bone, and I don't want to leave any. after we're done with this conversation. Just because, conversation. After you're done listening to me talk at you. So before I get started on that, I did want to mention, as far as this next week's episode on Wednesday is concerned, I am super interested in watching that new TV show. I think it's called Upload or something like that. It's on Amazon. It's an Amazon original. Basically, it's this idea that they made a virtual reality afterlife for your consciousness. So when your body goes, when it dies, you can live in this virtual world in perpetuity until you decide that you don't want to live there anymore, I guess. I don't know. I'm sure that there's a fail-safe where you can kill yourself, but that's dark, and we don't need to go there necessarily. So just keep that in mind. Otherwise, I'll be probably watching a different film for us to talk about, or maybe talking about a different concept in science fiction altogether. Consuming media has been the best way, I think, to kind of communicate with individuals during this quarantine, because we all have more time on our hands because we can't go out. So, on that note, Chapter 3 of Hyperion starts out with them arriving, or not arriving necessarily, but they're finishing out their journey on the boat up the river towards the Sea of Grass, is what I think they call it. It's the art that's on the cover of the novel is them on this Sea of Grass. So, I am interested to see how far along they get into this ocean or sea of grass before the novel ends, because there are 2 other novels in this series, and I am curious if we even get to hear all 10 tales, or if the book even wraps up in time for us to have heard them all and get resolution with what happens with the Shrike. So we'll see. I have a feeling that it would be kind of hard for it not to. It depends on how Simmons plans to write the books. Because if he planned to write them in a way, in the same way like Orson Scott Card did with Ender's Game, it was like, whoa, this was randomly super popular and now I can do some stories after it, but this is like kind of its own story encapsulated in one book, then I would be thrilled. But I have a feeling that he intended to write it as a trilogy, so I'm not going to get everything that I want out of the first book. But regardless, back to Martin Silenas. So he starts out basically by telling us that he was actually born on Old Earth, is what he calls it. And Old Earth is the Earth that we currently live on. He is hypothetically like 500 or some odd years old. And it's indicated at the beginning of the book that the consul, whose name I don't think we've actually heard, they just call him the consul, could tell that he had his age artificially extended, or his life artificially extended. And what we find out is that he has kind of done some experimental things for himself to where he got to live a lot longer. Cryogenic sleep in space is one of them. He does that multiple times. He gets a lot of like age reducing therapies and things like that. So he's lived for a very, very long time. He was actually around before the Shrike appeared on Hyperion, technically. And we'll get more into that later. But the beginning of the novel kind of starts with, not the novel, this chapter starts with Silenas talking about his childhood. There's some interesting stuff in there about how the wealthy upper class aristocrats of the world of Old Earth didn't want their children using certain technologies, so they would read, and they would like have to write things down rather than using computers. They didn't have access to all of the technology that a lot of the other people on the planet did. And that gave them some sort of like elitist advantage, maybe not in their opinion, but that was their belief, was that it did. They don't really clarify much in that regard, but that's kind of just what it seems, or how it seems to appear. And Silenas references just tons of allusions throughout the entirety of this particular tale, which I think is really good. And in some capacity, the part of the reason I say that this is the first chapter is because it feels like this is the part of the book where it's like things are finally moving. And this felt like something was actualized in this chapter, which is interesting because part of this chapter deals with the commentary on how it is that things come into being. And so I found that to be very interesting, that those two things kind of mirror each other, both in the novel and in the commentary that Simmons is trying to make. So And I apologize for the long pauses. I keep thinking to type period at the end of my sentence because I'll say something and then think, oh, period. And then it's like, okay, well, where do I go from here? Sometimes talking into a microphone, you get in the habit of thinking that you're talk texting or something like that. So that's a little confusing. But anyway, so Martin Silenas starts out describing his childhood to us. Seems like he was born very wealthy, had a lot of things going well for him. He says that he was born to be a poet, which is something that comes up multiple times throughout the tale, is that Silenas feels like it's inescapable. His draw to writing is inescapable. He can't not do it. Even the way in which he interacts with the world is kind of like a poet's way of interaction. And so he talks specifically a lot about the way in which he interacts with words and the meanings of things, and how he hates words because they ultimately have no meaning other than what meaning is ascribed to them, but people treat them as if they have meaning, and that is a whole philosophic school that I'm not even going to get into, or maybe I will. You'll find out right after this quick commercial break.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco, ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Making a joke that I was going to talk about, or I wasn't going to talk about how words have no meaning except for the meaning that people ascribe to them because they intrinsically aren't really things in the world until someone gives meaning to them. And I was saying that I wasn't going to talk about it, but I will definitely be mentioning that later. Again, I say this every week. I always do that where I'll say, we're not going to talk about that until later. And then hopefully I actually get to it. My brain is a large maze full of tangents and detours and loop-de-loops and rabbit holes. I don't know if you can actually get out of the maze. This could be like a Shining thing where it's just, never ending. At least it feels never ending. And then you freeze and die in the snow. But that'd be a little dark way to look at it. But that was kind of what we talked about on Wednesday, actually, was this movie called Pi. Anyway, I'm sure you all listened to it because my version of the Sci-Fi podcast is obviously your favorite version. So anyway, so Martin Silenas is telling his story about his upbringing and ultimately kind of the death of Old Earth and how we got to the current setting that we're in, which I think is interesting that Simmons chooses to put Silenas third, because Silenas really provides the most background and exposition into the plot of the actual novel when compared to the other tales, because Silenas is the one who's actually been around for the longest. And Silenas has always had this kind of like, I guess, he has this like religious figure air to him in that it feels like he is always on, like he's always got insight into something that somebody else doesn't, or kind of sees through the world in a way that other people don't see through it. So he's got this kind of like guru-like aspect to him. So I find it unsurprising that he also has been around for basically 500 or 600 years prior to this particular pilgrimage, and that he is, he was on Hyperion before people even knew that the Shrike existed. Though there's some indication in this particular story that Silenas is somewhat responsible for the Shrike existing, though I don't think that has any grounding in reality. If I had to guess, I would say that the Shrike appearing is just coincidental and is all part of like the Shrike's plan, quote unquote. Because it seems pretty clear to me that the Shrike has set certain things in motion to solicit other things to happen. And there are individuals who believe that the Shrike is like God embodied on this particular planet, so that it has like omnipotent power throughout the universe. And I would have a tendency to agree that in this particular setting, the Shrike is a god in some capacity, because it was able to influence Kasad far beyond the reaches of its like planetary atmosphere and things like that, because he was able to cause I can't even remember the Marietta, I think is her name, or something like that. If it is Marietta, that's kind of on the nose because it's a puppet's name, so like a marionette. But I just remember her name started with an M, so maybe I'm the one who's on the nose with saying Marietta. But I don't think that it is Silenas that brings the Shrike into being, because basically I'm jumping ahead here. Silenas tells us the story of how he ended up on Hyperion. And once he ended up on Hyperion is where things kind of get interesting, because that's where we start actually seeing the Shrike appear, which is the whole point of all these stories, is why are you getting called back to do the pilgrimage? But Simmons can't just say, well, I came here at this point in time and did this thing, and it's what I think made them want me to come back. Though I will say, in some capacity, every individual who has interacted with the Shrike has kind of actualized some aspect of the Shrike. Debatably has actualized some aspect of it, because it doesn't really seem as if the Shrike interacts with the world in the same way that like a god might. It seems like individuals' perceptions of it are somewhat what it is until it decides to be something for itself. Though I don't know if you could say something for itself. Again, it doesn't really describe whether or not this thing has agency. Simmons doesn't say if it has agency or not. So it's hard to kind of apply certain things to it, like motives and emotions and such, because the way that it interacts with the world is substantially different from the way that we interact with the world. But anyway, so Silenas, Old Earth dies, obviously. Well, not obviously, but I believe that I've mentioned that before, and that's why it's called Old Earth, is because it's dead. It basically kind of falls into ruin and becomes so corrupted by technology, pollution, nuclear warfare, all these other things, that it becomes uninhabitable. And Silenas's mother, who is portrayed as like a very strict and kind of like, you know, typical wealthy woman, no mention of a father figure, which I find to be interesting. He has this kind of strained relationship, kind of close relationship with her, but she ultimately is the one who decided that, or was trying to figure out how to perpetuate the wealth of her family into the future, because Silenas didn't have any children of his own, so there were no heirs to continue after she passed. She may not have had confidence that he was going to have children. Regardless, she puts him up as collateral for the accounts that she has, and then kind of like puts them into some specific form of interest accrual, and then sends him on a deep space journey where he's cryogenically frozen for 200 years and has a stroke during that time, which is fairly common for individuals who go into this experimental form of space travel, because normally you just accrue a time debt by, I can't remember exactly what they call it. Maybe it was far-seeking or like some specific, it's not far-seeking, but it's some specific kind of science fiction-y thing that I can't remember off the top of my head. But basically it's hypersleep. So instead of you just being frozen and waiting for the 200 years that it takes your spaceship to travel somewhere, you accrue a time debt, and then you, I don't know exactly, you cycle in and out or something like that, or you travel faster based off of certain things. It seems like the people who are cryogenically frozen take a slow spaceship, and the people who are not frozen, or who are frozen not nearly as long, because the ship that they're taking travels at a much faster pace, so they don't necessarily need to be frozen for as long. But anyway, Silenas gets this stroke, and when he comes to, he's lost pretty much all of the language center of his brain. I believe he says the left hemisphere or the right hemisphere, whichever one is associated with language, he loses completely. Though I do think it's interesting that like a lot of scientists and a lot of psychologists will talk about where things are centralized in the brain. But when people lose those parts of their brain, they're still able to create new habits that solicit similar results. And there are certain functions that might be lost permanently, but that might be from injury, it might be from something else, but to say that like this particular thing is housed in this particular part of the brain, I'm not necessarily certain is exactly correct. That's like, you know, saying that a person with one arm can only accomplish certain things, but it's like ultimately that one arm becomes very dexterous, so that one side of the brain might work much better than you think it's possible that it could. Regardless, when he comes to, he's lost pretty much every bit of language that he knew except for a bunch of obscenities, which leads to some pretty comical interactions between Silenas and the place that he ends up, where he ends up is this planet. The name escapes me at the moment. Heaven's Gate. It's called Heaven's Gate, which is of course ironic because while he's there, he's basically slave labor, mining on this planet, which is miserable, grueling work, because the money that was supposed to be accessible by him was frozen and seized by the hegemony, because supposedly everybody who would have been able to have access to those accounts died. So they didn't even know that Silenas was someone who could have had potential connections enough to actually be able to get at that money. So we're going to take another quick break, and then we're going to get into some actual commentary on what it is that Simmons is saying.
You really can't underestimate the importance of having the right creative work for your brand or your product. Whether it's a logo, a website, a book cover, or an ad campaign, you really need a quality design to make that big difference pop and deliver your overall engagement and success in a competitive market. That's where Design Crowd comes in. Design Crowd has over 750,000 designers from Sydney to San Francisco ready to help you with awesome creative ideas. They make crowdsourcing work for you. So if you need a logo or you're working on your creative branding, you can go to designcrowd.com and post a brief describing the design you need. And then within about 2 to 7 days, you'll receive up to over 100 different designs from designers around the world. Then you pick the best design and approve payment to the designer. So you're only paying for the design that you want. It takes a lot of the guesswork out of freelancing and out of crowdsourcing. And you don't have to be a huge company like Harvard Business School to use Design Crowd, although they have used it as well. You can start a project on Design Crowd for as little as $99. And if you go right now to designcrowd.com/health and wellness or enter the promo code health and wellness on their website, then our health and wellness listeners will receive up to $150 off of your design project. That's designcrowd.com/health and wellness or entering that promo code health and wellness.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Martin Silenas after he came out of his cryogenic sleep and his 200-year-long cryogenic nap while his spaceship traveled to a place called Heaven's Gate, and the fact that he had no money after waking up, so he becomes essentially slave labor, and he suffers this major stroke that basically leaves him with only swear words for vocabulary, which is pretty funny. But I think that the main point of this chapter is for Simmons to have a platform by which to comment on the importance of language and dialogue and rhetoric, just in the general scheme of not only literature, but human life and interaction itself. Because one of the biggest things that is kind of made apparent in this chapter is that words really are perceived as having a lot of power. And I think that what Simmons is doing is kind of playing on classic creation narratives. And that's pretty obvious considering that Silenas starts his piece by saying, in the beginning was the Word. And I think that's an obvious reference. There are numerous allusions throughout this particular chapter to John Keats and other important figures in the literary world. So it doesn't surprise me that he's making an allusion to the Bible or to creation narratives in general, because there's this idea that's pretty pervasive throughout classic mythology, if you will, that basically pretty much every creation narrative starts out with the deity of that narrative speaking into being the actual creation. So in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, blah, 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 from the Bible. Not to say blah, blah, blah heinously, but just because we're not focusing on that particular thing, just the idea, not specifically the Bible. Because the creation narrative in the Bible is actually best understood in juxtaposition to the other creation narratives at the time during which the creation narrative was written. And that's part of the reason why it is supposedly more potent or more true than other creation narratives that are available to us as individuals that attempt to explain the universe. So pretty much, like, even in Greek mythology, and definitely in Egyptian mythology, there is this creation narrative where the primary god speaks things into being, and things don't exist until there is a word for that thing, and then at that point that thing can exist. It's kind of like that old, I don't know if I'd call it a wives' tale necessarily, but it's like this urban legend type thing where when Columbus first arrived in the Caribbean, the indigenous people couldn't see the boats that they arrived on, but they saw the people once they landed on shore, because the boats, they didn't have a word for them. And what really is more likely that happened is that they didn't have a way to make up a word for those things. So when the Spanish were trying to interact with them, they just were like, those things. But it wasn't like they couldn't actually see them. It probably more of like a metaphor that they like saw them in a specific way. But there's this idea, and we talked about this when we talked about the film Arrival, that language shapes your perception of the world around you. And I find that to be a profoundly true statement in multiple capacities, especially in this particular chapter, because Silenas is able to find a new way to interact with the world through his limited vocabulary as he continues to develop it, because people are able to interact with him and communicate with him in ways that you wouldn't think that they would be able to, because his vocabulary is essentially limited to several very choice swear words, that some of which are not even really repeatable on any, like, anything that's going to be listened to by decent people. So, and we keep a PG rating on this podcast for sure, so I'm definitely not going to be saying all of them. But fair warning, if you listen to this on audiobook, you're definitely going to be like just kind of humming along, and then all of a sudden out of nowhere, it's just going to be like a lot of swear words. So, yeah, heads up, I guess. It probably would be nice if I listened to the chapter in advance and then gave you guys any warnings just in case there's explicit content. Though, based off of the last chapter, I'm pretty sure that at this point you know that this book is going to be explicit. So, Silenas starts to interact with the world with this new language, and he's able to form meaning from it. And people are able to have meaningful interactions with him despite it, which I found to be incredibly interesting, and like a really good way for Simmons to kind of comment on the intrinsic nature that the intrinsic need that individuals have for communication and interaction, so much so that even individuals who have these huge language barriers ultimately will find a way to communicate in some capacity with other individuals, because it's such an important aspect of survival to be able to communicate. Even with a super limited vocabulary, you're going to figure out a way to do so. So I think that is part of what Simmons is trying to say in Silenas' story. And then Silenas, his story really kind of has three parts to it, which is interesting because it's the third and there's three parts to it. The second part is after he leaves Heaven's Gate. Actually, I think he even qualifies it as three different acts, which I think is of course interesting. A lot of this book is written in like a very stylistic manner. So it's just interesting to kind of notice the ways in which Simmons is embodying these styles. So in the second act, we get a lot of this like social commentary and predictive science fiction that I actually found to be incredibly insightful and also terrifying, because I feel like it's insightful because it represents something that's true and a potential possibility. So Silenas leaves Heaven's Gate and starts writing again, and he happens to stumble into some success with a book about old Earth. And it's this like classic saga, hero's tale type of thing that sells like billions of units across the universe and makes him a ton of money all the time. So he's basically just, almost infinitely wealthy. And if he had died, then he would have continued to accrue wealth. But because he lives for so long, his bank accounts get drained, essentially, is what happens. And then he also gets married a couple of times, and that takes its financial toll in some capacity as well. And then he becomes very opulent and affluent. Not that he wasn't already, because he was born in wealth, so I'm not surprised. But he becomes very opulent and affluent and starts making these ridiculous purchases that are just difficult to upkeep, and they cost tons and tons of money at all times. So it just becomes very burdensome. So he actually has to go back to writing again. Well, he comes back and he writes this series of poems called the Hyperion Cantos, I think is what they are. I'm not sure if they're actually the Hyperion Cantos. They might be called that. I can't remember for sure. But basically, it's a bunch of poetry about him being on Heaven's Gate. And it is so powerful that it moves the editor that reads it to tears. And she says, we won't sell any copies of it. And I'm going to kind of talk about why that's super important and what it is that Simmons says and why they won't sell any copies of it right after this next quick commercial break.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
So right before the break, I was kind of mentioning that Dan Simmons gets into some predictive science fiction stuff here. And I just kind of wanted to touch on that because I felt like it's really important to mention because a lot of what he says is very poignant. So Silenas writes this book of poetry and he wants to release it. And the editor says, we'll release anything that you write because you wrote us a book that sold 3 billion copies. And what they do is they kind of deceive him. Because, well, and they don't necessarily deceive him. He kind of plays himself. They give him a huge advance on the sales for this particular poem. And because of that advance, he ends up being beholden to them for a lot of money, and he continues to get advances as he continues to work for them and publish other books for them. He is basically forced to publish sequels to the book that sold 3 billion copies, which was the Death of Old Earth, I think is what it was called. And so he has to write the Death of Old Earth for like 9 books is what I think he ends up writing it for. But when he writes the poetry, he writes it in a way that's incredibly beautiful and moves moves people who read it who can read it. But what we're informed of as a reader is basically that individuals don't consume things via books anymore. Nobody orders, I think, what they call hardcover facsimiles, which would be like an analog book. No one orders them anymore. And because no one is actually looking at books, they're losing their literacy. And so individuals just like, I guess, would listen to a book rather than pick it up and read it. And, of course, with poetry, part of the point of poetry is to see it. So, you know, Silenas wrote it with, like, particular, like, free verse and other things like that. And he's allowed to keep all of that in this particular version. Because in the original book that he wrote, he was forced to kind of change it into something much more commercial. And so they took out a lot of, like, the free verse and these other experimental sections that Silenas included in order to sell more units. And Silenas is always confused as to why this book of poetry, which is actually his best work, is just not selling the same way that his Death of Old Earth book sold originally. And the woman who runs the publishing company keeps referencing The Pilgrim's Progress book, which is ultimately a mediocre book that was very popular popular during like colonial times in America. It's basically this giant allegory of a journey of faith of this individual. So it's called The Pilgrim's Progress, which it is interesting. C.S. Lewis really loved that book, and he loved it so much that he wrote a book called The Pilgrim's Regress, which I have a copy of but haven't read. And that is exactly what the female publisher compares Silenas's first book to, is that everybody wanted to own a copy, but nobody actually read it. And the people who did actually read it enjoyed it enough to tell people that you have to have a copy of it. But it was kind of like this fluke where suddenly there was this like perfect opportunity at just the right time for everybody in culture to want to share in this idea. And so everybody decided to jump on the train of purchasing this book and owning it, but never reading it. So ultimately, like, they didn't have any familiarity with what Silenas was about. They just bought the book in order to have it. And that's like 200 years prior, or at least 100 years prior to everything that's happening in our current situation. Or no, I think it may even be 300 years prior to everything that's happening in our current situation. But the book is so gone from the general like public knowledge that even the consul hasn't mentioned it. Nobody has mentioned the book that Silenas wrote in the first place, which is really interesting because it's a book that sold 3 billion copies. That's a lot of copies of a book. So it's surprising that they wouldn't have recognized his name. So Silenas wrote this book. He gets published, or writes this poetry, and he gets published, and then he ends up being beholden to the publishing company for more books. And this is probably Simmons making some commentary on the publishing industry in general, which they probably have found ways in the past to get people stuck in contracts and owing them money in order to get more writing out of them, but the writing ultimately ends up not being exactly what that author wants to write. And so I think Simmons is kind of commenting on this idea of like selling out, or this idea of appealing to the marketplace. It's interesting. Regardless, there's a lot of interactions that Silenas has with this woman who does the publishing, where we're getting this predictive aspect of science fiction that I think is ultimately really scary, because it does reflect some of the direction in which we are potentially headed as a civilization. For instance, this idea that literacy rates will drop in the future because everything is so easily consumed via other means is not a surprising prediction to me in any capacity. A lot of science fiction authors have centered their ideas around the fact that people don't read books anymore. And I think there's this statistic that's given as like something anecdotal by the publisher, who said back in this particular year, most people didn't even read a single book in a year. And I thought that was just crazy, and then realized that I haven't finished a book in a year in a long time, because I'll start one book and then start another book subsequently, and then I'll be reading multiple books at the same time, bouncing back and forth between books. There's one book that I had that took me 3 years to read through, and it was amazing. I really loved that book, and I will probably read through it again much faster, but it took me 3 years to get through it. But I was reading other books at the same time. But all that to say, the fact that I could probably guess that a lot of people don't actually read. They might listen to a book on audiobook like I'm doing with this particular book, because I really just don't have time to read 800 pages of a book, unfortunately, as much as I would like to. I'm sorry, Dan Simmons. I feel like listening to this book kind of goes against like the very core value that he might espouse. So I do feel kind of hypocritical, and I guess my sincerest condolences. Regardless, I think that this is a terrifying prediction, and I think that it's one that actually we could see come to fruition, is that a lot of people just end up not being able to read because they don't have to, because ultimately everything is fed to them via some sort of like alternative interaction. And then learning is changed. The way that people learn is changed into like virtual reality. And so there's much less human interaction. And because there's less human interaction, language changes and all these other things that kind of end up with this very I don't know if you want to call it like sheep-like or cow-like population, but it's basically a population full of people who aren't able to critically consume anything, and ultimately that's why the poetry that Silenas publishes after his book called The Death of Old Earth, that's why it fails. And so I think that it's interesting that, like, there's different points at which in this story Silenas has power, and the points at which it would seem like he has a lot of power, he has absolutely none. And it isn't until he completely relinquishes the fact that he thinks he has power that he's able to actually enact his will on the world or have some sort of beneficial interaction with the world around him, which I find to be incredibly interesting and kind of a statement on the way in which we interact with the world as individuals, because it seems like the more will we try to impose on the things around us, the less the things around us want to cooperate with us in that regard, which I find to be like terrifying and hilarious all at the same time. Because, you know, you kind of want to live under this illusion that the things that you say have power, but at the same time, if you think that they do, then you're expecting specific results from them. And if you're expecting specific things out of words, then ultimately you're not placing your hope in the proper places or placing your power in the proper places. And I think that that's something that Simmons is trying to make a commentary on in this particular regard. So we're going to keep talking about this third chapter right after this next quick commercial break.
The GSMC Life and Happiness podcast takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible. Download the GSMC Life and Happiness podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Break with me. So right before the break, we were talking about this idea that, or the idea of when it is that Silenas has power over the universe around him with his words. It kind of feels like this particular story is symbolic in a number of ways, especially in, like, when you kind of take into consideration, it feels almost like a transformative tale in a much larger capacity than the other tales, because it feels kind of like the realization of power within an individual. And I think that the interaction of that power, or the actualization of that power, is intrinsically tied to this idea of language and the idea of, like, words having power in some capacity. We were kind of in the middle of this, of the story where Simmons is making a bunch of predictions about like what the future is going to look like, and we're talking about lower literacy rates to the point where only 2% of the population can even read, and we're talking about this idea that people are just consuming things via different means, and they don't actually they own books. We talked about this idea of the Pilgrim's Progress, where there's this weird, like, singular opportunity within a 500-year span for there to be this particular work of fiction or something like that that everybody feels the need to own, because it's just such a major part of the zeitgeist that to not own it would mean that you're actively not including yourself from that particular interaction in society. And so I just think that Simmons is kind of making this really interesting commentary on the idea of the ways in which, like, language causes thought, and thought is what causes, like, I guess, I don't know, critical intelligence or things like that. Because as Silenas kind of gradually succumbs to the technologies of the future, we see him having to become more active as an individual in those places and become more mindful in ways that he didn't have to be before, which I think is interesting because it's not as if we start out in like current day. We don't know exactly when it was that he was born on Old Earth, and if we do, I don't remember off the top of my head. I believe it's future from now. It may have been 2020. I'm not totally sure. Regardless, when he's interacting with the world there, it becomes mindless for him to read, to think critically. Like, all those things become secondary. And so, that, and to use like highfalutin or fancy talking language, like to do those types of things becomes mindless for him because it's what he was bred and raised to do. And as he loses access to all those things through miscellaneous means, whether that's brain injuries or what have you, or just proximity via time, he has to become more mindful of those things. And ultimately, his becoming more mindful of those things leads to him becoming more and more detached from the world around him. And as he becomes more and more detached from the world around him, he actually ends up having more and more sway over it, which I think is really interesting because it kind of speaks to this idea, like more ideas of Nietzsche and the Übermensch in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which I believe is actually modeled after the Pilgrim's Progress in a particular fashion, because it's like an allegorical journey of actualization that's associated with some spirituality of some sort. The ideal man is the Übermensch, who I believe is like the man on the mountain or something like that, and that man exists as a genius outside of society because genius is rejected by society, because the point of the genius is to push society forward. And if the society were to embrace the genius, quote unquote, which Nietzsche is using genius in an unweighted fashion, we have a lot of associations and connotations to that word where it's like explicitly positive. Nietzsche's using it in a way that is just to say that certain individuals are wired in certain ways to accomplish certain tasks, and you can rise, quote unquote rise, not as in there's like a hierarchical system of intelligence, but you can rise to the level of being an Übermensch and still be involved in whatever tropic environment it is that you want to be involved in. But in this particular case, the genius kind of exists in isolation, and the fact that Simmons references Silenas as being the satyr several times, to me indicates that he is absolutely trying to talk about Nietzsche again, because if you've read a fair amount of Nietzsche, which of all the philosophers that I've read, I think I've actually read 2 Nietzsche books, so I'm familiar with 2 Nietzsche works at least, which is more than I can say for any other philosopher other than maybe Descartes. But if you read The Birth of Tragedy, it's all based on Greek mythology, satyrs, centaurs, all of that stuff are Greek mythology. You've also got like this idea of the satyr is very present in like not medieval, but like classic Celtic mythology, I believe, as well. But basically the satyr is like a poet that runs around and is like, they're kind of like a very sexually active goat who they are basically bards. And so they kind of like record the world in isolation. They exist outside of it. But like part of the interaction that they have with the world is that they actualize things in the world because they kind of dictate the direction in which language flows because they are creators of art. And I think that Simmons is trying to say that art is not beholden to language. Language is beholden to art. And that in turn, art is not beholden to society, and it shouldn't be. Society ought to be beholden to art, as in art incurs change in society. Society doesn't incur change in art, which I think is a really interesting point for a science fiction author to make, because he's pretty much always writing in the future as things change and evolve and grow, and he's making predictions about how the future will be and saying, like, no, there's still these universal principles of what it is that people ought to be reading and how they ought to be reading it. that we should be following and holding up as being virtuous in some capacity, that are just really interesting in juxtaposition with this idea of a future world, a futuristic world, especially in juxtaposition to Silenas' story, which is basically like everything I knew is dead. And I thought that I had to become this new person, but ultimately, like, my purpose never changed, and it was always to be this isolated genius, because this is the second time his story is bookended by periods of him identifying with the satyr. He identifies with the satyr at the beginning of his story when he's still on Old Earth, and he identifies with the satyr at the end. And it's during both of these times that it seems that he has the most control over the world around him, though he lacks really boundaries and such on his exploits in some capacity. He specifically applies a role to himself and fulfills that role. So he's not out doing all of the frivolous things that he was doing when he was wealthy, but he is actively participating in the world in a particular way that's actually soliciting certain results. And I think that it's very interesting that Simmons absolutely intentionally juxtaposes these ideas. So we're going to take one last quick commercial break here, and after that we'll talk about the third part of the story. We might go a little over time with this because I've spent so much time in the middle portion here because I felt it was important. So I apologize. We'll be right back.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Stretch here. Not that this is like a difficult thing, so I guess in the home stretch might be the wrong phrase. Regardless. So as we get to the final part of Silenas' story, we finally get to the Shrike, which it's funny. I find myself thinking in every story, when are we going to actually get to the planet Hyperion? It feels like every story it takes longer and longer for the pertinent information that I want to know, which is everything about the Shrike and Hyperion, to actually finally hit. And I think part of the reason for that is, well, obviously it's intentional in some capacity. At least I would hope it is. If it's not consciously intentional, then it's subconsciously intentional, in my opinion. But we're not going to get into that argument. Carl Jung has a few things to say about that. And so does the book Maps of Meaning. Yeah, Maps of Meaning. Anyway, so we get to the end of this chapter, and what we find is that Silenas has fled to Hyperion after basically telling the publication company to go pound sand. He flees to Hyperion in exile to live with a man by the name of Sad King Billy, who has basically established this kingdom of artists and craftsmen. And he establishes that kingdom throughout a few different systems and basically just tries to kind of live outside of the hegemony in a more, I guess, organic or realistic way. It feels like he's kind of trying to interact with the world in a way that's closer to what, like, good artistic representation might be. I'm not totally sure exactly how to qualify it, but basically it's just a bunch of artists, and Sad King Billy finds himself very endeared to Silenas because of his Hyperion cantos, or that book of poetry that he published years and years before. So he says, yes, of course you can join us. And then this is the point at which Silenas begins to identify again as the satyr. So he lives on Hyperion in the city. They talk about Keats, John Keats again, the name of the city from the name of the city that they landed in when they first arrived on Hyperion. And I think Keats also wrote the Hyperion cantos, the originals. of which the book is loosely based off of. I should probably reread those so that we can talk about how loosely it is. That might be another episode after we finish the book of, like, these are all the references that I had to go over in order to understand the symbolism and things. So, basically an appendix. Anyway, so we arrive to the end of the story, and suddenly out of nowhere, everything's fine on Hyperion, and then Silenas, which part of the reason that he decides to leave the publication company is because he believes that he has lost his muse, and it's because he has this computer that interacts with his subconscious, and his subconscious tells him, oh, I've lost my muse. So he has to go find it again. Well, he goes to Hyperion and can't seem to find it until there's this weird string of murders that start happening in the same city that he is in. And people believe that he is somehow involved because he has suddenly disappeared into isolation and then started writing again at the same time as these murders have occurred. And they're grisly, horrendous murders that involve a lot of pain, which I find to be very interesting. It seems that the Shrike has an affinity for suffering in a physical capacity. So I find that to be very interesting, but that's neither here nor there. So Silenas begins to write, but he writes about the Shrike prior to it showing up. And not in the capacity that, like, it's going to come and do all these awful things, but in the capacity that, like, the Shrike becomes his muse. And so as these murders continue to happen and King Billy tries to figure out who's murdering all of these people and how they're experiencing so many casualties in this particular area, they basically call Silenas in, and Billy accuses Silenas of actualizing this creature in some capacity, whether that's through his own actions or something else. So there is this idea that kind of comes to a head at the end of the chapter, which I'm not going to give away the whole spoiler of it. But basically, there's this belief that if there's something in particular that is destroyed, that the Shrike will be destroyed. Because the Shrike only exists in language, in linguistic representation, and not in actuality. But what happens is that the Shrike appears to Silenas and interacts with him and King Billy in a particular way that solicits this, basically these exclamations of destroy. If you can destroy the language that is representative of the Shrike, then you destroy the Shrike itself because it can no longer exist if there's no linguistic representation of it. And the linguistic representation of it comes from the writing that is inspired by it in Silenas. At least that's the belief of Sad King Billy. And so we get this really interesting commentary on kind of like this idea of creation and this idea of the fact that the human mind is in some capacity a creator. It's a creator of things. It's a creator of things in the world because it creates language which solicits an association of symbols. And this is like a really deep, dark rabbit hole of where do things come from and how do we get at this idea of the thing in itself that Simmons is kind of commenting on. And this is something that almost every philosopher ever has interacted with, especially people who are focused on like ontology, I think so. I'm not sure if that's the right word. And epistemology, things like that, where we're talking about like where do words come from, where does thought come from, how is thought formed, and then is thought representative of something, or is thought a series of symbols that we associate with things? Are things in the world actually as we think them to be? And so the interaction that Silenas and Sad King Billy and the Shrike all have is kind of like this cacophony of different perceptions of reality that all kind of come to a head basically with the philosophical argument, like you can tell me that things are all symbolic and they are what you perceive of them, but if I hit you in the head with a 2x4, then you are going to experience pain and your jaw will break and blah, 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 blah. And those are all realities. So it doesn't matter if you tell me that those things are just all symbolically represented by language. There's still a reality that can smack you in the face. And I, to that argument, would say that those things are only being quantified in certain capacities based off of our patterned interaction with the world. So it might be that all of those things would happen. But to say that that argument serves as a reasonable justification for trying to tell me that my mind can conceptualize things in reality, I just don't think that it serves it well, because it's putting a distinctly negative connotation on a specific interaction. And while that specific interaction in our current understanding is absolutely negative, if you were to understand the world in a different capacity, then there is a way that that particular interaction might be viewed as positive. And so it would be basically a useless argument to say, well, this thing will actually happen. Well, it's like, okay, so, and what? That doesn't mean that we're actually getting at the interaction of the thing in itself. Like, it's nice that a 2x4 hits me in the face, my jaw breaks, I bleed, it causes me a lot of pain, I have to go to the hospital. Like, all those things are actualities associated with an action, but they're all represented by words, ultimately, and those words have an infinite number of associations with them that go further and further down at infinity to associations that we aren't even familiar with. There is some memory that we have of something, or there is something coded in our genetic material that causes us to believe that these things exist in a specific capacity, blah, 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 blah. I could go on for a long time about this particular subject because I feel very passionately about the fact that ultimately we can't get at the things in the world ourselves, and therefore any words or categorizations that we come up with to attempt to actualize something have nothing to do with the way in which things actually are. They're simply patterned responses formed via neural connections that are conclusions drawn based on interactions that we have with the world that either increase or decrease our likelihood of eternality in some capacity. And I think that that's kind of what Simmons is getting at here, is that, like, it's not that the Shrike was actualized by the writings of Silenas. It's not that the consequences of the Shrike's appearance are solicited by Silenas. It's that we believe that they are because we give ourselves this idea that we have power over the world around us, but ultimately the world around us exists in a capacity beyond our understanding. So regardless of if we think that we have understanding of it or not, the way that it hits us is like a 2x4 in the face, because we ultimately don't understand it, and we need to acknowledge that in some capacity in order to have any semblance of power over it. And I think that's kind of why Silenas is able to interact with the Shrike in the way that he does at the end of his story. So anyway, kind of wrapping up here. Don't want to go too far over time. So I just, I do appreciate you guys listening through all of this. We'll be talking about Chapter 4 next Sunday, which I'm pretty excited about. Hopefully there's another tale in there, but it seems like we might be kind of taking a breath from that. I've been listening to the first part of the chapter, and it looks like some exposition as to the journey. So we'll see where that goes. And then I'll talk to you guys on Wednesday with that podcast. If you liked this, definitely hit like and subscribe. Give us a 5-star rating. Leave a comment. If you want to toss my name out there, then maybe they'll mention me in the Slack chat channel that all of our podcast hosts share, which would be super cool. So if you love me, definitely leave me a 5-star review. I would think that's great. And feel free to leave comments and reviews, and even if you don't like me, I really want to hear everybody's thoughts on this, and some feedback and interaction with the audience would be great. So thank you everybody for listening. Stay safe out there. Seems like we're getting close to being through this, so hopefully we don't get any kind of second wave because we go back too fast or too slow or what have you. So good luck everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts SciFi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.